struggle for truth and healing, which isn't an easy or comfortable conversation, but it's certainly a timely and important one, not just here in the United States, but for many countries, nations, and peoples struggling to come to terms with their pasts. For example, what was done and perhaps continues to be done. Questions of truth, responsibility, and accountability, and the layers of impact, burdens, and legacies that remain. This event is a collaboration between many organizations, including Mershon's Transitioning from Violence Consortium. I'd just like to name the advisory committee institutions and thank them for their support: Ulster University, Bradford University, the Northern Ireland Executive, and the Corrymeela community. We are currently working with dozens of scholars and practitioners and policy framers trying to understand restorative and transformational processes, including rites, rituals, ceremonies, and traditions as pathways to justice, healing, and social integration, as well as our partnership with the Divided Community Project, where we have been engaging with and studying truth and reconciliation type processes, more specifically here in the United States. I would like to now introduce you to my colleague and dear friend, Carl Smallwood, who is the director of the Divided Community Project at the Moritz College of Law. He will share more about Divided Community's efforts. He'll frame today's conversation and introduce our speakers. Carl has been actively engaged as a lawyer and influential leader here at OSU, in Columbus, and at the national level, serving as past president of the Columbus Bar Association and the National Conference of Bar Presidents. I must say that the executive committee of the Divided Community Project has been a true inspiration to me personally and professionally, and it has been a special privilege to work alongside the clear-sightedness and the kindness of Carl. Carl?
Thank you, Terry, and you'll learn as members of our audience that it's sort of a mutual admiration society, because we love working with Mershon and are excited today to talk about a statewide United States-based process chartered to pursue truth and healing concerning the state of California and California Native American tribes. As Terry mentioned, the Divided Community Project is housed here at the Moritz College of Law. We're designers of dispute resolution processes, mediators, conciliators. We assist communities to address conflict when it arises and to consult and plan in advance of conflict to make communities more resilient. We focus on divisions caused by race, religion, immigration status, water and land claims, and other societal fractures, including threats to democracy that threaten everybody's ability to resolve conflict. We train leaders, and upon request, we intervene to assist local leadership in communities and on college and university campuses to address conflict. We are grateful to Terry Murphy and Dory Noyes at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies for their collaboration in this important work and for inviting us into this important program. In the wake of George Floyd's murder in May of 2020, we, like some others, have diligently sought to learn from truth, healing, reconciliation, and peacemaking processes in Northern Ireland, the Middle East, North Africa, South America, and elsewhere. And I know there are friends on the line from some of those regions, and it's great to see you. But we did so to study and come alongside initiatives like TRC-style racial equity initiatives that we saw emerging here in the United States. In New York City, San Francisco, Charleston, South Carolina, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Iowa City, and elsewhere, and statewide in California, Maryland, and Maine. Much attention was given to processes focused upon descendants of African slaves, not exclusively, but certainly it has been a focus of most of these commissions. Last year, DCP and the Moritz College of Law collaborated with colleagues at Stanford and Harvard Law Schools to produce a symposium series, Rethinking System Design for Racial Justice and Equity. And we had an opportunity to work with Janet Martinez. Janet is the director of the Martin Daniel Gould Center for Conflict Resolution and a senior lecturer in law at Stanford Law School. You can call her Dr. Martinez. She's kind enough to permit most of us to call her Jan. She's a legal scholar. She has done research, writing, and teaching in various aspects of dispute resolution at Harvard University's graduate schools of business, law, and government. And Jan will begin the conversation today with our special guest, Dr. Kouslaa Kessler-Mata, a member descendant of the Northern Chumash and Yokut tribes. She is an associate professor in politics department at the University of San Francisco, having worked with the California Indian Legal Services and the National Congress of American Indians. Presently, she's a member of the California Truth and Healing Council and the American Indian Education Oversight Committee for the California Department of Education. I know we will enjoy and learn much from visiting with Dr. Kessler-Mata, and we welcome you here today. As we begin today's conversation, I and we at Ohio State must acknowledge that the land that the Ohio State University occupies is the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. Specifically, the university resides on land ceded in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and the forced removal of tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. As a land-grant institution, we want to honor the resiliency of those tribal nations and recognize the historical context that has and continues to affect the indigenous peoples of this land. I don't make that land acknowledgement to signal virtue. We appreciate that this acknowledgement, standing alone, may sound hollow. It does not address many concerns of the indigenous people removed from these lands, but acknowledgement may be a step in the direction of truth. There are harsh, painful truths here and in California. One truth is that in the early decades of California statehood, the relationship between the state and California Native Americans was fraught with violence, exploitation, dispossession, and the attempted destruction of tribal communities. Another truth is that in his 1851 State of the State address, California's first governor declared that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. And then they funded that effort. Another truth is that California Governor Gavin Newsom, 4 years ago, in June of 2019, issued an executive order that contained an apology on behalf of the citizens of the state of California to all California Native Americans for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect California inflicted on tribes, and created the Truth and Healing Council to bear witness to, record, examine existing documentation of, and receive California Native American narratives regarding the historical relationship between the state of California and California Native Americans, to clarify the historical record of this relationship in the spirit of truth and healing. Truth and healing. We'll look forward to exploring those concepts in the context of this council in conversation with Dr. Kessler-Mata. Will this process provide truth? If so, whose truth? Can the process set the stage for healing? If so, how? As we turn to this conversation, we know it will be instructive to take a deeper dive into process, structure, culture, and the traditions that underlie the California Truth and Healing Council. This council process is different than the California Reparations Task Force and many other TRCs. We hope to explore how the structure operates, how it reflects culture, traditions, rituals, and dignity of the Native Americans engaged in this process. The aims are truth and healing. Dr. Kessler-Mata will talk about those concepts. Some words are not part of the name of this council. Reparations, reconciliation, land back. Dr. Kessler-Mata may talk about whether and how those concepts also fit within the framework of the Truth and Healing Council. We hope to explore the complexity of this work, the struggles, challenges, and opportunities in this work. Finally, you'll note the tone of this conversation. First, we will seek to do no harm. We know that we sit with a council member during this truth and healing process. We will seek to be respectful, inquisitive, humble, and grateful that we might have an opportunity to learn. We are woefully ignorant of the history of injustice towards Native Americans and unaware of their history and traditions because of concepts like erasure. Some parts of history will reveal uncomfortable truths. We admit we do not know, and we hope to learn. The work of the California Truth and Healing Council is serious, difficult, and emotional. So we approach this conversation with humility and respect. We will invite you to join the conversation near the top of the hour and ask that you do so with the same spirit. We will ask you to submit questions in the Q&A portal at any time during the course of this webinar using the Q&A ability on Zoom. And we will incorporate your questions into the conversation once we get close to the top of the hour. So with that background, Jan, can you begin our conversation?
I can if I unmute. Yes. Good day to everyone. Thank you to Terry, to Carl, to Bill, and Danny, who's a little bit offline, for organizing and hosting us. And my deepest thanks to Kouslaa. I am so honored to chat with her and to do that chat live. Kouslaa, thank you for your company and our friendship that will evolve, I hope. Okay. So thank you, Carl, for setting up the topic and the enormity of what we're talking about. We only have an hour to spend together, but I wanted to touch a little bit on what you've already referenced, which is the notion of the goals of a process. And I think what strikes me is your last comment, do no harm, is that the harms are not just historical, they are ongoing. And so any conversation, engagement around these issues now is likely very raw and perhaps incredible because of this history. And so one of the things that I think about is the goal of the process, who's involved in that process, what are the options for engaging the process. And Kouslaa has written a lot about how to structure self-determination. And so I think let's start with the truth and healing question, because I think it's clearly in the title of the commission that's doing the work and the engagement. But as have found in a lot of the research and experience in looking at such processes, what is the goal and who decides the goal and what does it mean? So what does truth mean? What does healing mean? And like Carl said, why isn't justice there? Why isn't reconciliation there? And all these goals are important for two levels. One is the focus. Make sure that we know what we are working on and what we're trying to achieve. And two, at the back end, at some point in time, is to be able to assess, did what we attempted to do work? Did it help? And that will be important both to the people involved in this process, but also the rest of the country who are struggling with similar challenges. So the goal, what does it mean? Was there conversation about what it could mean? As many of these good goals are like mom and apple pie. They're great. We want them all. But what are the metrics for measuring whether we have found them, and who decides the trade-offs? Is the focus on peace? We don't have live violence right now with tribes in California that I'm aware of, but we could. And so is peace a question? And how might we think about these different goals? And what do you find most meaningful? So I've given you a lot of options to play with there, Kouslaa.
Thanks, Jan. And wow. Okay. Yes, there's a great deal of stuff to discuss there. I just first want to thank everyone for inviting me to this forum, and especially to thank you for actually considering this focus on California Indians, because that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face in the state, and of course in other contexts as well. But visibilizing our issues, our concerns, it's very meaningful to me. So I appreciate that. To that extent, though, I should also say I'm just, myself. I'm here representing myself in my individual capacity. I'm not representing the council in any of my comments. I hope, and I think the nature of this conversation is that it's a reflective process. So I'm processing this stuff as much as I am kind of on the spot, but I want to be transparent about that because, as Jan indicated, it's not, this is not something that's complete. It's not finished. I may have a different opinion of how it all worked at the end and so forth. So just to kind of qualify my comments in that context. So again, my name is Kouslaa. I am a Chumash and Yokut, specifically Yaktitu Tichu Yaktilhini Chumash community, which is from around the Avila Beach area in California. My Yokut ancestry is from Martin Estrada's family. We are located slightly inland from where the Yaktitu Tichu community is, and my family hails from the San Joaquin Valley. So a couple of initial responses to Jan's questions regarding the goals of the Truth and Healing Council. After Governor Newsom's apology, which was quite significant, I think, for most California Indians, to finally be recognized and acknowledged, right, that something terrible had happened here, and to a non-California Native audience as well, right, because it received a lot of visibility across the state. That apology was meaningful and symbolic, at the same time that it set forth a new policy era for the state. And the state has, through the Office of the Tribal Advisor, attempted to start pushing forward some of these policies around land back, around helping tribes participate in different types of fora, tribes that are unfederally recognized, that lack federal recognition. So there's a lot of different things that have happened in addition to and immediately after the apology. The formation of the Truth and Healing Council is one of those things. So the state is moving forward on multiple fronts. That said, I should really emphasize that it is the state that is moving forward in these efforts. So each of these policies and proposals are being led by the Office of the Tribal Advisor, who themselves, is represented through a secretary of this, that is California Indian, which is important. But it's not a tribal push, right? So it's not something that came from tribes. It's not something whose goals were set by tribes. And in the Truth and Healing Council process, the lead up to the establishment of the council, there were listening sessions and open forums that the state hosted to help develop the goals of the council. But I would say it's very hard for one person to approach over 109 federally recognized tribes in the state, along with 70 or so unrecognized tribal communities, plus folks who are not affiliated with their tribes for whatever reasons, who are California Native people. It's really hard for one person to reach out to all of these different communities and actually receive constructive feedback and figure out how to move forward. So along with all of their other duties. So in general, I would say there were some concerns raised by the community in each of those listening sessions regarding what is happening, who's setting the goals, exactly the questions that you kind of raised, Jen, were the concerns of the community. And so the goal of the council when we were seated was to kind of unveil those truths, right? To kind of do a historical accounting and hear from California Native folks. The council itself is composed of a voting assembly, right? So we are appointed by the governor. We have been asked to take an oath to the state, which some of us have chosen not to do, but in order to receive any kind of compensation for basic things like travel to attend meetings and so forth, in order to be paid by the state, we need to be aligned or affiliated with the state in a formal way, hence the oath. Again, I've chosen not to do that, and so therefore all of the expenses come out of my pocket, which is, a hard ask, to be quite frank about it. But we come together and we have members from different regions from across the state. We are not representing any particular tribe. We are really there to help facilitate a process where we are helping elevate and amplify issues and concerns that are coming from tribal communities across the state. So while we are kind of configured geographically, that's not, the things that we're doing in the council work are not necessarily mapped on to those particular regions. And we are in no way, shape, or form expected to represent tribal communities, right? So we're not elected in any way, shape, or form. We are nominated by our communities, though.
So I think that opens a question of, this is not the only process, right? There are efforts at the federal level. I'm not sure how active they are, but there's certainly conceptually opportunities to explore legal redress at the federal level, the state level that you've touched on that we're doing in California. And you also have communities, I would imagine, and tribal leaders who are engaging with their communities around other cross-cutting issues that are of mutual concern. So are there parallel processes that are seeking to advance some of these goals?
So I will say that even within the Truth and Healing Council, we are still trying to shape the goals of the council at the same time that we're actually moving forward. So there are, as far as I know, there are perhaps a few local level efforts, like, if you take, for example, folks up in Wiyot territory in Northern California, where the local government has committed the land back to the Wiyot tribe. And it's a very significant process that started a few years ago, and the tribe has now taken some of the land, their historical territory back into their possession, which was great, right? So an actual land back effort was completed at the local level. We're seeing some of that, we've seen the city of Oakland across the bay work to really find an avenue for land back for the Ohlone in the East Bay. And that has faced some challenges in terms of how to administer that. But I will say land back as a theme or as a reparative effort is really central and key when you're talking about Indigenous communities, right? So what is unique and distinctive about Indigenous rights claims really centers on land, because land is almost everything, right? It's culture, it's language, it's the people, it's our relationship to the world. So you can't disentangle land from these efforts. But you're absolutely right. Land is not in the title. It's not, and I can only imagine why, right? It's also the hardest ask, right? In terms of thinking about placing demands on institutions, whether it be a university or, or the state. Land back is a tall order, and it requires a lot of effort. And advocacy.
Mhm. Yeah, your last comment makes me wonder, there are many options in terms of process and engagement, and I want to ask you more particularly about your thinking on structuring engagement. But before that, I wondered if you have a sense of sequence. Are there things that need to happen sooner in order to leverage the capacity to have this land conversation?
Sooner rather than later, or is that, I mean, is that like,
Yeah, just sooner. Yeah. Are there things that need to come first? For example, to establish any credibility of the effort or the process or the leadership? Maybe not necessary, but would help. It would help if some things happened sooner. And then that hard conversation might be more accessible.
Right. I mean, it's hard to say that Governor Newsom has also, again, working simultaneously on multiple fronts, put forward a statement about native lands and has tasked several people in his administration with really looking at supporting native land back efforts. He had also proposed for about $100 million to go towards that. Of course, in California, that's pennies, but that's okay. I got it. But unfortunately, that was not supported in the legislature. So, and this is, I think, where the rub is structurally, right? Which is to say, the California Truth and Healing Council operates as a function of the governor's office. It does not have widespread political support of the California Reparations Committee, for example, task force, who is a creature of and a function of the efforts of the legislature, right? So the legislature created the California Reparations Task Force, funded the California Reparations Task Force, embedded it into the California Department of Justice, whereas the California Truth and Healing Council is the child of the governor's office, right? It is that's where it originated. That's our story, our origin stories in the governor's office. The governor does not have widespread access to the funding, right, that is needed to necessarily carry out this type of work. So we really need allies to support that. But I can tell you, as a California Indian, finding allies, whether amongst communities of color or, even Indigenous people from outside of the state, can be quite challenging.
So does that set you up to be able to talk about your scholarship and trying to think about, this is what the federal levels are playing with, this is what California legislature, California executive are playing with. I'd like to hear more about the community piece, and also, just not to leave them out, the judicial function. Is there case law live somewhere across the land that has potential impact on this process?
Interesting. So maybe first on the structural issue, your structural question. I do think that the community is probably the place where most of the work is happening now, which is to say the governor's office is really focusing on having listening sessions out in the community, hearing directly from tribal community members. And the goal there, of course, is to take testimony and listen to folks about their experiences. I think my own opinion is that we can really tighten up how we engage community, but also think about how to assess and, as you said, kind of indicate some metrics about the work that we're doing. And one of those ways is to actually put the spotlight on the state rather than putting the spotlight all the time on Native people, because there is a lot of trauma that happens and having to recount a lot of the different instances where, in fact, right, there are contemporary conflicts with especially law enforcement and whatnot around basic access rights for gathering, whether it be abalone or beargrass or what have you, when you're trying to access your cultural, materials, and those challenges create conflicts with the state, and then we're asked to, talk about those things in a public forum. Again, one of the limitations of being a government task or government council is that all of these things are public record, right? So there's no kind of anonymity, there's no real way to protect people, at least from my perspective. I feel like when you come before the state and you start, you present information, you have to expect that that's going to enter into the public record, right? And so there's a lot of implications for that process. But I actually think that we could instead focus on the state. So just like, we do evaluations or reviews of departments and programs, we should have the state having its own internal evaluations of each department. How has it been engaging California American Indians? I sit on the advisory council for the superintendent for education in California, and we don't currently have in place a consultation policy for working with tribal governments. That's a big oversight. So we're now working, there's a subcommittee that's now working on the creation of a consultation policy with the state. But there's a lot that the state can do to say, how are we or how are we not supporting our California Native American communities in the state? So I feel like that is something the state can do, has the capacity to do, has the obligation to do. And if it's really serious about telling truth, right, tell its own truth. Tell us how many Native people are, arrested, how many are in our prison systems, right? Do that inventory. What does home ownership look like? What are those basic social economic factors look like of California Indians? We don't have the data right now. So I would say that's what I think the state can do. California Indians, yes, we have things we need to say, but we also have specific agencies, specific government departments that we have messages to communicate to, right? So across the state, we have tribal historic preservation officers who are aware of the issues in their communities. They have messages for the state about how perhaps our transportation, California Department of Transportation is working, about contacting and working with tribes when bones are unearthed and so on and so forth. There's a lot of feedback that the state can be processing about the work that it's currently doing and how it's, perpetuating harms on California Indian communities. But that's not the way that our council is oriented. And I've made some efforts to try and redirect our attention, but unfortunately thus far, it's kind of fallen on deaf ears.
Well, I've had some exposure to thinking about this from the African American perspective with the San Francisco working group, and thinking about, like you just mentioned, the centrality of housing and then the consequential harms that arise in terms of education, environmental pollution, healthcare, and a whole series of consequences that flow from the misalignment of rights and respect within our state. So I'm trying to think about what you just said, if there would be some organizing department. Increasing the bureaucracy doesn't sound like the right answer to public policy problems, but I think it's absolutely part of the solution, thinking that we can gather the data. Another factor that might be of use is just the capacity of using technology, to hearing if there's a kinder way to get the stories and the information that you're talking about and the data from the various agencies, that might be captured in some way through technology, and being able to build a database of understanding, acknowledgement, and understanding, and what options for improvement and policy shifting might remediate some of those harms. Do you have some other thoughts that you could share on your structuring self-determination? I think that's one of the powerful goals in conflict resolution is autonomy and the capacity to make choices, policy choices, and control your prospects. And I wondered if you could share a little bit of your thinking around what does that look like, and how do you imagine it might be supported and advanced?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think probably where we've gotten, at least from my perspective, the most traction on enabling and supporting tribal self-determination is actually through a partnership or work with the Decolonizing Wealth Fund, which is, or Decolonizing Wealth Project, which has a liberated capital fund. And we work with them, we as in several members from the council sit on the Liberated Capital Fund to help distribute funding to California Indian communities. In theory, the funding is supposed to go to tribes who are engaged in supporting the work of the Truth and Healing Council. So you can apply for a grant of up to $50,000. And the goal is perhaps you would be doing important work that your tribe defines as healing or in support of your self-determination, but which our hope is that you will share that work with the council, so it will become a part of our record, right? But there's no obligation or requirement that at the end of the day that happen. So we've given out about $500,000. We've only had a couple of funding cycles so far. There's been the Decolonizing Wealth Project is trying to build up that funding, the store of cash for us to be able to fund additional projects. But we've funded things like families who had experience through the residential schools in California. So California Native families who experience residential schools, and they're exploring both how that impacted their family, but also sharing that story, because when people think about residential schools, first, of course, folks think about Canada, but the United States, right, also had residential schools, and California, moreover, also had residential schools. And our California Indian people were taken from California and moved across the country as well. So hearing and telling those stories and their impact. Again, residential schools are not a state policy. The state of California did not create residential schools. That was more federal level, right? But we recognize that this is part of the harm of the institutions of government, right, that have happened. And we want to encourage folks to be able to share their stories about these types of the effect of these policies. We've also funded tribes that are seeking to demarcate their ancestral territories. So there's a huge region in California where there are absolutely no federally recognized tribes, and that area is north of Santa Barbara, right? So we've got the Santa Ynez Chumash there, north of Santa Barbara, all the way up, right, until really Grayton Rancheria, and that's north of San Francisco. So the entire central coast of California is absent of federally recognized tribes. Now I know that, Jan, you're familiar with the state, but this is prime real estate, right? Both in terms of natural resource extraction, right? So for businesses and companies interested in that, but also for very wealthy communities and so forth. So that land was, through a variety of means, fell out of California Indian hands. Especially, of course, during the mission system, which, mind you, the mission system existed prior to California. The state of California Truth and Healing Council is not actually endeavoring to look at and examine what happened before the creation of the state. So we don't address the mission system explicitly. But the dispossession happened starting prior to the state's creation. So we are helping tribes to giving them financial support to be able to do mapping, to work with various academic institutions that may have the documents, right? So tribes need access to documents that will help evidence their ancestral territories. And that matters, right? Knowing and being able to demarcate your boundaries matters, because when it comes to land back, right, if you can't say this is actually our ancestral territory, how are folks going to know who to give land to? You don't just give land to a native person who's not even from California in California, right? We are very much tied to our specific geographies. And so it's really important. And those are conflicts we have to also resolve within our communities as well, between different California Indian communities. But certainly supporting those efforts, supporting tribes to be able to document where they're from and who they are is a part of the Decolonizing Wealth Fund's efforts. So that has, I think, really been the space where I've been able to see, right, like some self-determination support happening from this effort. I would say it's I think also the space for healing, because when I think about healing, somebody can't heal you, right? It's not like a doctor comes in and puts some antibiotic ointment on and wraps up your injury. It's really about an internal process where you are empowered to be able to have that space for self-determination. And that looks like language programs, that looks like land back, that looks like sharing your traditions with your youth, right? So youth programs and so forth. Like all that's what healing looks like. It's internal. It's not something that you do really in partnership with other people, right? At least not from my perspective. That's not how I imagine healing.
Yeah. That is a really deeply moving comment that you've just shared with us. My last question, you and I are both parents. And so I think now that I'm at a point of retiring, I'm kind of looking back and what did I do with my life? And did I make a difference? And what will my children think of my efforts or not? My daughter was shocked when she found out my doctor wasn't a medical doctor, and therefore I was not going to help people in a medical way. But when you think about the path that you've been on and what you're hoping to achieve, what is the thing that you want to share in your heart, if that's not too personal a question, with your children? And I know your mother before you so have laid a path of support and care and commitment to somehow going past the harm and moving forward in the ways that you've described.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to be honest with you, I think I come from a slightly different generation in terms of, like, when I think about California Indian activists and academics and so forth, like, we now have a huge, I mean, from my perspective, a huge number of California Indian academics. We have a California Indian Studies and Scholars Association, which has both kind of the more senior folks who were around when no one else when they were the lone ones going through departments and programs, and then down to folks that are more junior than I am, who are just starting on the tenure track and whatnot. And I'm still kind of a little bit from the generation where it's like, I don't really have time to emote very much. I think about what I'm doing, but I just do it, right? You don't just you don't kind of sit in your feelings too much. And I think I see the limits to that sometimes. And I certainly see it on the California Truth and Healing Council, because I don't necessarily, again, I mentioned this is going to be a reflective process in our discussion. I don't necessarily want to put trauma out there. I'm interested in policy proposals that will change things. I'm interested in creating agendas that are going to shift the power balance and try and advocate in that way. So my own strengths are not necessarily on the processing of some of the historical information. It's really heavy, right? It's not, again, it's a really heavy burden to have to, and I say this as a people, right? To have to put all of that out there. And the thing is, this is kind of what kills me. The state knows, right? We're not unveiling something new. We've had federal level as well as state level insights into these things. We have what's called the ACCIP report that happened at the federal level, looking at California Indians and our histories and conditions and how those were directly related to different policies, right? What we're not so clear on is how those things are taking place today. And that's, I think, where we really have to focus is how are California Indian people still being re-traumatized and harmed by state entities.
Kouslaa, thank you very much for sharing a whole raft of ideas and experiential reflections. And I'm going to turn it over to Carl and Terry to engage some of our listeners. And thank you for offering more comments with us.
Thank you to both of you. And Jan, please feel free. We really like this to feel like a conversation. So please do feel free to continue. Kouslaa, I just have a couple questions for you that are probably a little bit more broad and less really specific to structure, but I think really important that our listeners might value hearing your reflections, knowing that this is your personal opinion. So the title for this discussion today came out of a New York Times article, and the author wondered if the governor's support for a range of racial justice and equity initiatives was part of some cultural moment in which Americans seem to be increasingly grappling with the nation's sins.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could reflect with us about that. So my sub-questions to you are, is it possible to reckon with and repair this country's racial past? If so, what obstacles stand in the way of moving forward? Mm-hmm. Then in the context of California, and you've mentioned self-determination, empowerment, land back, new policies, what does reparation and restoration mean to Native American peoples? And would they say that justice and healing is even possible?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So the question, is it possible to repair our racial past? I think a lot of us are looking right now at Canada and seeing, right, the Pope, who had come and had his apology last summer, and then now has, made some comments about the doctrine of discovery, right? So, and there's debate about whether or not it's actually been rescinded or has, repudiated, like what has happened with the doctrine of discovery. But certainly it's a response to what the Pope heard when he was in Canada and the conversations that emerged as a result of that on the ground appearance, right? So him actually being physically present and hearing from people. And so I think in Canada, right, they seem to be on the precipice of, okay, well, now that that's happened, right? And of course, in its statement, the Vatican was very clear to say, well, in 1537, we had already, right, stated that Indigenous people had full rights and shouldn't be enslaved, right? So they were sure to say that, we've already said this, right? But we're going to say it again. So I get that acknowledging is important, right? And this is the thing with apologies, right? But what does happen, right, with some open and more widely accepted acknowledgement that the doctrine of discovery is flawed and that therefore all of the land theft that happened as a result is flawed, right? What can the church do to repair that, right? And, one idea, of course, is to give back the land that it currently holds, right, in Canada. And again, we could have this whole entire same conversation about the United States. But right, so that's one of the things is land back. And again, this is where I don't know, if you consider, and this is where the conversation about racializing Indigenous people is challenging, right? Because you asked about repairing our racial past, and yes, natives were racialized in order to dispossess them of land, right? And at the same time, the prognosis may not be, right, of course, to deracialize, right, and to say, now we're going to treat you the same as everyone else. The repair, the moving forward, is to say, okay, we have messed up, yes. We have done these things for unjust reasons, and now we need to recognize that you get to determine what that repair looks like, right? Now it's you tell us, right, how we can alleviate that challenge. And I think, unfortunately, in the conversation, I think for Indigenous people, that conversation then is like land back, right? But even as I have experienced in my own conversations with my students, when you really press students on, okay, what does land back look like? And they say, well, I'm a resident of California. I'm not really prone to giving up my land, right? Like, my family worked really hard to buy this land, and yes, it's native land, and yes, it originally fell out of hands for unjust reasons. In California, we had 18 treaties that were unratified with 7.5 million acres of land that are now held not by tribes, but by both individual Indians and companies and the state and so forth. But no one is actually interested, very, very few people, I would say, are actually interested in giving their land back. And so that's the rub, right? It's happening, and it's happening in small measure in certain places. But just like with reparations, when we look at the Pew public opinion polling on reparations, there is not widespread support for reparations either. So I think that's where the tension is we're asking for land back. Perhaps African American communities through these reparations conversations are talking about cash, money, dollars, right? Actual payment. I get that. But in both of those cases, that's a hard sell, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because if we had a speaker a couple of years ago talk about, if you take my bike, give me my bike back. If you really want there to be justice, then you got to give me my bike back. So something simple like a bike is palatable.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking my window, you need to fix my window. Giving my land back, it's exponential at that point, right? And that's where you start seeing people go, oh, I'm not so sure about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's good to put the finger on that. That's really the rub. My second question, and I'll hand it over to Bill and Carl, and this has to do with the project I mentioned in the opening that's taking a look at different pathways that communities at the community level. So many transitional processes are very similar, where you have a state, in this case, you have the governor kind of create a structure and a system and a set of processes, and people engage, but it's not necessarily even involving the community in the kind of the conceptualization and the visioning and even what they prioritize. So we're working at the community level, where so much of the burden rests trying to understand what are community responses, and what are the pathways that they use, especially when it comes to transitioning communities back together. And we know that each commission is historically and politically and socially and culturally embedded, and that the injustices and the grievances and the political priorities and the social realities, the process themselves are always going to be unique to a setting. So we know that. And still there might be some things that we can learn more generally. So if it is appropriate, wondering if you could describe some of the, I know there isn't a cultural belief system, but maybe there are some cultural beliefs that helped shape the work of the council, and its current priorities or its mandate, and then whether or not there are some potentially transformative processes that have been incorporated either at the council level or within, when you go into tribal communities, that encourage truth and justice or healing. And if so, why do you think those practices are important? What are the intentions? If you could just tell us a little bit about kind of the process itself, because I'm guessing that some restorative principles are guiding those interactions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's likely true. And yet, as a council, we are not tasked with any of the administrative organization. So that is to say, we have not provided any guidance or provided any input into how those things are structured. So whether it's the format or the processes for engaging community, and those are beyond our purview. But I can say that most of them are pretty standard for Native organizations, and the kind of moment of prayer in the beginning is really to symbolize, right, a time to make sure that you're coming to the table with good intentions and you're going to do things in a good way, right? So it's kind of this intention setting of reminding you where you're at and what the purpose and function of this is. And so that's an important, I think, process to make sure that people are kind of leaving things, whatever it may be, personal or otherwise, at the table, at the door, and kind of joining the table from a clean slate and a good position, and to empower yourself to remember that you're doing this for other people, right? So this really is about facilitating a process and not about centering yourself, right? So that is super important, especially when you've got folks that are in politics, which is the majority of the folks at the table, right? When we go into community, right, it's level the playing field, right? It's like, as you indicated, all politics are local, and that's especially true in Native communities. We've been subject to a number of concerns in every space and location in California. So if we have a community hearing or a listening session in a place that is being hosted by a tribe, but the tribe happens to have some membership dispute issues or some kind of political issue, we will be sure to hear about it, right? And that's good, right? That's important. Disenrollment and other related issues are important conversation issues, important issues of conversation. Is it the purview of the Truth and Healing Council? Sometimes not, right? So the Truth and Healing Council is really supposed to put the state's feet to the fire. It's not supposed to be focused on lateral issues within tribal communities. And that is hard to, it's a delicate process because, there are very real grievances within and amongst tribes. But at the same time, our focus really needs to be on making sure it's our opportunity to tell the state, right, how to correct course and to acknowledge some of the things that it's done in the past. And so we try not to lose sight of that. And so the council, even at times when we want to hear folks out on, whatever challenges they're facing internally to their tribes, we have to prioritize that focus on the state.
Right.
That makes people upset sometimes.
Of course it does. All right. Thank you. Carl, I see you moved places.
Fortunately, Bill's office isn't too far away, but thank you. I'm sorry, I apologize for the technical issues. And Kouslaa, thank you so much. I guess I wanted to follow up a little bit on some of the conversation, and I've caught 95% of it, I think. But in watching these various commission and council processes, it always seems to be the case that the council itself, or it often seems to be the case that the council itself is made up of the affected communities. And particularly in a case like this, where truth is one of the prime purposes, it's helpful to have the council so populated so that the historical record, the creation of that record, isn't influenced, it's not filtered, it's not diluted, it's not diminished or determined by people who are non-native in this case. But we spoke a little bit, or at least I know you've spoken about traditions, rituals. I spoke a little bit about the ignorance of a significant part of the population about Native American culture, traditions, history. I wonder if you just could share your thoughts a little bit about how and when the broader community can be brought into this conversation. And I ask that for two reasons. One is, I've watched some of the YouTube videos of the council proceedings, and they are different.
they feel different than some of the council proceedings or commission proceedings I've seen in other communities. And it's sort of a welcome, a horizontal, we will hear you, respectful process. Because I think because of who is conducting the process and how they are conducting the process. And so that's one lesson, you know, we might take from this council process. But the other thing is obviously in terms of translating it into policy, the broader community, the state government, business community, other parts of the community need to be brought into the conversation and educated. Can you just share your thoughts about how that might occur in this circumstance?
Yeah, well, again, I think it speaks to design. So, you know, when we look at, we had a side meeting to the UN Permanent Forum, maybe, I don't know, during COVID. It was on Zoom, I remember that. And it was, there was a woman from Alaska who discussed the similar efforts happening there. They were not state-led, they're from an NGO, a community-based organization level, and they were really focused on, you know, Alaska. But one of the elements that I thought was so inspiring about their design was that they invited in non-native community leaders, right, into kind of the periphery, right? If you imagine, you know, it's a kind of box seating, right, at an opera house or something. They were there in the room as observers, but not expected or encouraged to participate. And they were there kind of to serve as interlocutors with others. So they were particularly they're picked because they were leaders in their communities, and they were there to listen to the history, to all of the conversation about the issues affecting the Native communities and such. And then the expectation is there to go out and help facilitate the awareness and change, right? To be kind of change within their sphere and help that process along. So I think to the extent that we as a state kind of rest on PR and kind of, you know, framing and narrative work, you know, if people are not interested, they're not interested, right? Or they're maybe they're sympathetic, but they don't see themselves in the game. But I think what was innovative and interesting about the Alaska model was that it actually brought those folks into the room and that had key, you know, people in the room that could then go out and help proselytize in a sense, right? And raise the issue and raise the awareness. So you're kind of expanding, you know, the folks that can speak to it. So I can't say that we are necessarily well positioned at this point in time to do that. I don't know what will happen when we produce our report in 2025, right, the final report, and how that will roll out. But I certainly think that having non-native participants, at least as observers, is important to bear witness, right?
And start that over. You were on mute.
I was on mute, I'm sorry. Okay, absolutely. And you know, we have with the California reparations task force, which you mentioned earlier, which was created in a different fashion, which is supported in a different fashion. We saw last year in June their initial report, which was addressed to the history of African Americans, descendants of African slaves in California. And it is a remarkable record of history that has probably not gotten as much attention as it should. But
A comment. This is perhaps a comment that is in trying to speak to the question indirectly, I suppose. And so when the university took up, so it required political will, right, of course. And so you have to make sure that there is, at least from my perspective, leadership involved in the formation of these task force or, you know, committees, whatever it may be. And I mean, the political will to also understand that there may be some commitments that come out as a result, right? So, and this is, was a gray area for me. We were fortunate to onboard a new provost and a whole actually new suite of provosts who saw some value and wanted to actually understand our relationship to Indigenous communities. Admittedly, the AJCUs are a little bit behind. The American Jesuit colleges and universities are a little bit behind in this process. We are starting up a conference next year that will address slavery and reparations related matters and our relationship to Indigenous communities. So as a collective institution, we're also moving forward on that. But we met with our local tribal community from the Ohlone community in San Francisco. And, our president, our provost had a sit down with him, and they said, essentially, what can we do for you? And I knew this conversation was coming. And so the chairman of the tribe and I had spoken already. We are friends. And he was like, don't ask me what you can do for us or for the tribe. But if you want to, unless you have land to give back, right? Which it's San Francisco. The University of San Francisco did not at that moment in time entertain that question. But he also didn't seriously pose it, right? He threw it out there. He didn't actually seek to engage it. But he said, if on the other hand, you want to think about what we can do together, right, then I have several things that we can consider. And so it was really about a partnership, right? So what does this partnership look like? And he said, we want to advance our core responsibilities. And this is an unrecognized tribe. They don't have land. They don't have federal recognition, so they don't have any kind of legal standing in that sense. But he said, our core purpose or function is to, protect the most marginalized and advance the needs of our community in the natural environment. So that is to say, repair the local environment. And so for him, it was really about how can the university support the tribe's goals, right? Institutionally. So it was thinking about what resources do we have, what programming, whether it's in our law school or in our nursing program or in our education. We have a college that produces PhDs in education, so the ed program. How can we, as an institution, use our existing resources to support what the tribe wants, needs, et cetera, right? How they're determining what those things are. And to me, I felt like that was a really productive way about starting this out, because we can't necessarily look back and say, okay, the University of San Francisco was founded at a time when the Ramaytush had already been pushed off of this territory. So, it's easy for the university to say, oh, well, we don't have any responsibility or any relationship to that because that wasn't we didn't colonize this place. But this was a kind of entry point for us to be able to start building something together, even when that kind of explicit or direct connection doesn't exist in the past, right?
I love this illustration of partnership. In my conversations with Terry, she's always emphasizing partnership. For example, Terry, I just want to highlight this, and I appreciate that illustration. I want to acknowledge that we have about 8 minutes left and 3 questions in the chat, which we won't get to all of them, but I do want to ask one. I know, Josh, you asked a question about land restoration. I'll just note that. We might have time to send a written message. And Donna, I'll note that you talked about California history beyond universities. I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer that question specifically, but I did want to ask from our friend, privilege our friend from Northern Ireland, who asks the following question. You mentioned your interest and focus on developing specific apologies to advance healing and justice. She's involved in policy in Northern Ireland, and she wonders about how you go about building consensus around public policy and or prioritization of public policy. And so that's the last audience question. And then before we turn back to Terry and or Jan to conclude.
That's a great question. And I would say that right now, I think that's one of our biggest challenges, right, is actually finding a way and a venue to be able to do that, because there are lots of regional, California is a very big state, right? And there are lots of regional organizations that help facilitate that, but usually it's around a specific issue. So there's like the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, but that doesn't involve or include Indigenous people that have been disenrolled or who's, kind of got other issues that they want to highlight or amplify. It doesn't include tribes that are not federally recognized, right? We have Northern California Tribal Chairmen's Association similarly, right, situated. So it really doesn't enable broader conversations across the state that are inclusive of all of the different political dimensions of the people. So that's a very hard thing to structure, and I don't know how to do that, but that is one of the only ways that we could build consensus per se. I mean, I think land back is the one thing that probably every California Indian agrees on. Exactly how that happens or what that policy looks like, is actually a little bit more disputed because you can do it wrong, right? And that looks like, giving or helping support transferring land to the wrong tribe, right? To someone in the wrong ancestral territory. And that has also happened. And so we have to be very careful about these policies, but there is presently no mechanism for building consensus.
Thank you, Kouslaa. And I suppose having perhaps 30 more seconds, I might quickly ask this fascinating question about from Donna, where she wonders if there's any headway that's been developed in the way privileged people view their own history in California beyond universities. Perhaps there's an interesting shift that can emerge in other places that create new opportunities to push forward, quote, reparations.
Yeah.
If you can answer that in a short time.
For sure. And actually, it's one of my long-term interests, which is really looking at how corporations and economic development in California, which have probably benefited the most, right, off of the dispossession of California Indian lands. It's not necessarily the state, right? It's everyone else in the state that is actually directly benefiting from this. To kind of see, okay, well, do you even understand your own history, right? Do you understand the place where you are geographically located? What makes the Central Valley and its agricultural production, or Silicon Valley and its, and its kind of cultures of, rebellion and so forth. All of this is done on California Indian land, and it's completely ignored the history of the place. And it's this kind of golden state, land of opportunity vision or narrative that we have about California is really wrong, right? And it's both factually wrong, right? This was not terra nullius, but it's also philosophically wrong insofar as it doesn't enable us to think about what our commitments and responsibilities are towards others. So I do think there's a lot of room there. I think it starts potentially in the philanthropic world. I think, you can bring to bear some companies whose roots are deep in the state, such as, I probably shouldn't name individual companies, but if you think back to the gold rush era, right, you can see who helped form some of the economic and support some of the economic engines, original economic engines in the state, and talk to them and get them to see what can happen there, right? See how they can help start directing funds and committing their responsibilities and understanding their own relationship and history to California Indians.
Thank you, Kouslaa. It's really been a pleasure to pepper you with a few questions derived from our wonderful participants from across the globe. And I'll turn it over to Terry to close us out for the afternoon/morning.
So Kouslaa, you began by thanking us for this conversation, and you described it as visibilizing what has happened and is happening for California Native Americans. And to visibilize reminded me of a poem that Ingrid de Kock, who is a South African writer, she wrote about the process of healing in their country. And she likened it to sewing and mending or stitching their country back together. And I think it's a strong visual because the thread that she talks about itself is red and means blood. It's a very short little poem. It's called Mending. In and out, behind, across, the former gesture binds the cloth. The stitcheries a surgeon's rhyme, a Chinese stamp, a pantomime of print. Then spoor, then trail of red. Scabs rise, stigmata from the thread. A cotton chronicle congealed, a histogram of whelps and wheels. The woman plies her ancient art, her needle sutures as it darts, scoring, scripting, scarring, stitching, the invisible mending of the heart. I think this is a wonderful metaphor for the process of truth-telling and healing that at once stitches and scars and scripts and scores. How do we as a nation of nations come to grips with our sins and our past, especially, as you say, when they are costly and where there are multiple pasts and multiple presents that will inevitably lead to multiple futures. So I think the now matters, because in itself, it scores and scripts and will congeal one way or another. So the California's Truth and Healing Council, I think, offers us a spore, a glimpse, even a vision, not just of an outcome, but the way itself, as imperfect as it may be. So we are grateful to learn from you and Jan. So thank you to both of you, to Carl, Bill, and to those listening in today. I trust that all of us have learned a lot and we have much to reflect upon. Take care.
Thanks so much.